Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are visiting with Kelly Sanders and Taylor Garcia from Westway Feed Products to discuss the biggest questions they get from producers about liquid feed. These two do not shy away from going in depth on these questions and offer a tremendous amount of food for thought for all of us ranchers. Both Kelly and Taylor are a wealth of knowledge for ranchers and passionate about the industry itself. So I can guarantee you will enjoy this conversation and get so much out of it. In fact, it might be one you want to listen to 2 or 3 times. But with that, let's hear what Kelly and Taylor have to share. Good morning, Kelly and Taylor. Kelly, welcome back to the show. Taylor, welcome to the show. It is a pleasure to have both of you on, and I'm excited to talk about this conversation because today we're going to talk about 2 of the main questions you two or Westway itself gets about liquid feed and really that liquid feed conversation again. But before we dive into that, to help the audience get to know both of you, and kind of a hard-hitting yet fun question is, why do each of you believe in the beef industry? Kelly, let's start with you.
Wow, that's a really good question. Just thinking about my history and how I grew up in agriculture, and I just know that that's, part of the bread and butter of our country. And really, it's a higher calling if you really think about it, Shay. We are in this industry, whether you're in the beef industry or doesn't matter. We're feeding the country, we're feeding the world. And so we have a lot of responsibility on our shoulders, and it gives you a real purpose for me to be able to know that I am working in an industry, specifically the beef industry that I love, that is given not only back to this country and the people of this country, but also to the world to basically feed the world. So that's my short answer.
Absolutely. Taylor, how about yourself?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of pride that goes into it. It's a lifestyle for a lot of people. It's probably not the easiest job in the world, but there's a lot of pride in that just goes into just beef cattle and everything about running a ranch. And at the end of the day, I would much prefer to eat a steak over some of our other proteins like chicken and pork. I'm not saying that those aren't important and that obviously those are important as a food source but I would much prefer to eat a ribeye. And so that's also rewarding is whenever you're directly able to raise that and pass that on to the next generation, like my 2 boys.
Absolutely. Both great reasons, and thank you for sharing those. I know you guys didn't have that question ahead of time. So jumping right into the conversation, as I understand it, one of the main questions about liquid feed is, does liquid feed have urea in it? And should that be a concern for the cow-calf producer? So Kelly, what is your response to that?
That is a question that we get often, especially with new producers that haven't had any experience feeding urea in some type of liquid supplement for beef cattle on, especially the pasture. But really what you're asking me is it safe? Is it safe to put out there? And my question a lot of times is it safe to feed corn? Most people are going to say, well, yeah, of course it's, safe to feed corn, but, corn can have the same of effect basically, which is you can kill cattle feeding too much corn too, right? And so that's the whole thing with urea. You can have challenges and cause some problems by overfeeding urea, but when fed in the right amounts, it's extremely safe and it's extremely effective protein source. And it's one of the most cheapest protein sources that there is out there today. So it has its place and it has its advantages, right? To really go into that a little bit more, Shay, is you just need to go back in time a little bit and say, why do people think that feeding urea is not safe? And I think it has to do with history. Liquid feed kind of came on the scene about 1930. We didn't know a lot about it. We had molasses, we had some urea, and I think as a general rule, we just kind of threw it out there and mixed it together and thought this is going to be great. But we didn't really know how to manage those things. We didn't know how to manufacture some of those things. We didn't know how ingredients needed to be put with those particular ingredients with urea molasses to really make it safer. We didn't know how to manage intake either. And so throughout the years, through research, through development, through experience, we've learned that there's a better way to manufacture these particular products and to make them safer. We've learned that when you put specific ingredients together, you can slow down the release of urea in those liquids, making it safer. We've also learned that you can manage intake through different ingredients as well and combined with these liquid supplements. And so we can control the intake of cattle. So now we're in, a cow's eating 2 or 3 pounds of liquid. She's not eating that all at once. She's eating it 2 or 3 times during the day. So we just broken up the meal size. So ultimately, they're just getting a little bit of urea at a time in that particular supplement. The other thing to really note that makes it safer is molasses and the sucrose that's in molasses, which is the sugar portion, correct? Because molasses comes from sugar milling. That's a critical point that we all need to address a lot of times is the rumen itself, the bacteria themselves, they need an energy source and they need a nitrogen source. And so ultimately, that's what happens. Sucrose digests it's completed in about an hour in the rumen itself. And so urea is somewhere around the same thing, 30 minutes to an hour. So they fit really nice in the whole fermentation process together. And what we're doing there is when you put those two together, those bacteria can use that ammonia that's produced by the urea, and they can actually increase or replicate themselves. So we actually are starting the engine of fermentation right off the bat each time those cows go buy a lick tub and lick a half a pound or a pound of liquid, depending on how much they're consuming, right? And so when you put all those things together, they really complement one another and make it a very effective supplementation source for beef cattle on pasture. So the question is it safe? Just like feeding corn, when it's done correctly, fed in the proper amounts, then yes, it's completely safe. And that's one thing about Westway. We've pioneered a lot of that different technology from managing intake and things of that nature. So our knowledge in that particular arena of technology around managing intake, manufacturing feeds, like I said, I feel like we've led the way over the years in actually doing that. Gives me a lot of great comfort in the fact that I can recommend these products and know that when we put them out on a ranch, those cattle are going to do really well. So that answers the safe problem. Why do people have that thought process or connotation about liquid feed? Well, historically, when we actually started putting them liquid feed into the field and feeding cattle, we didn't know how to do it. And so there was cattle that had urea toxicity. And we did kill some cattle throughout the years. And it was just based on our ignorance of how we feed it, how we manufacture it. And Taylor, I know you've had experience because you're in the field all the time. And so you get this question. You've also have an extensive knowledge on that. You might want to share some of the things that you've experienced and what people have told you.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's one of those things that's been passed down from grandpa had a bad experience with it, or maybe he heard during like what you were mentioning in the 60s, 70s when they were really starting to experiment with these things. We really didn't know how much we could put into the diets. A lot of times those were going in at, upwards to 50% of the total diet. And so what we know now is that is way too high. Urea is going to just in terms of how much of it is in the supplement and then how much of the supplement actually makes up the total diet. We're not going to exceed 1.52%. On finishing diet, we could get a little bit higher, but I think it was just one of those things that's been passed down. Well, grandpa didn't like it. He maybe had a bad experience, and that's just kind of gone into dad and then now the sons or daughters. But when we dissect that and we're able to kind of educate the rancher, the producer on why urea is beneficial for the diet and what value it brings to them, we can really open up their eyes. I think we're making progress in the industry. I don't think we're quite there yet, but one thing that's eye-opening is when you look and see how many cattle are fed in the US and how many of those diets contain urea. I think tubs, liquid feed are the main ones that are, I guess, identified as urea based, and dry feeds are what we would call true proteins. but a lot of times there's urea actually in a cube. And so I think a lot of producers don't realize that. And to go off of Kelly's point, is corn safe? I think anything that's fed too much can be detrimental. And so when we feed it correctly and we know what we're doing, it can be very valuable in terms of just economics. It's a really useful feed stuff or an ingredient that we use just in the cattle industry in general.
All right. Can we take a step back and talk just a little bit about what exactly is urea as an ingredient?
A lot of people think of urea as a fertilizer. We apply it in the springtime, about this time of the year when grass is starting to grow. We'll go put it out as a nitrogen source because we know plants respond to nitrogen, especially your more improved forages. And so I think that's kind of the mindset is it's a fertilizer, but then when we use it as a feed ingredient, that again kind of adds to its bad rap. And so what urea is essentially it's two ammonias attached together. And when it's hydrolyzed in the rumen, those two ammonias split off and gives off a carbon dioxide. And then what you're left with is ammonia. And so the fiber digesters, most of those are going to prefer that ammonia as their nitrogen source. And so regardless if we're feeding urea or not, let's say they're getting what we would call natural protein or true protein, those rumen microbes are going to break that down into ammonia anyway, because that is their preferred nitrogen source. They couple that with an energy source, and then they're able to replicate, and you get more microbial growth, which then leads into other things. But essentially, what we're doing is just providing those rumen microbes with a preferred nitrogen source. And so when we measure crude protein, what we're doing is we're getting a measure of the nitrogen content in a feedstuff. And so, some may not be familiar with or may have seen that urea equates to 281% crude protein. And basically what that is that urea is approximately 46% nitrogen. And so when you look at a protein, 16% of that is going to be nitrogen. And so when you do that math, that's how we get the 281% crude protein. And so just to put that in perspective, soybean meal, which would be considered kind of a gold standard plant protein, that's going to be somewhere in the low 40% crude protein. And so when you just think about that, is essentially what we've got is an extremely concentrated nitrogen source that's readily available to the rumen microbes, and we're providing it in the form that they want, and then they're able to utilize it essentially right away.
If you think about that too, about that whole nitrogen piece and feeding the bugs, if you look at grass itself, right, it's made up of a lot of different sugars and as well as, cellulose and things of that nature. But those sugars are some of the first things that are digested by those bacteria at different rates. Sucrose being one of those, and that's one of the first ones they're going to digest. So when we add molasses to it, we're actually complementing what's already natural to the bacteria themselves. But as Taylor said, by providing some ammonia or urea that turns into ammonia, we're kind of doing the exact same thing. We're complementing those bacteria by giving them what they want and coupling it together to make them more efficient, to get the whole engine running in the rumen so they can digest that forage.
So you brought up, you know, getting those microbes going, making them more efficient, making the cattle more feed efficient in that digestion process. That in itself is a cost benefit of utilizing it. What are some other cost benefits that make this a affordable feed source when we're looking at liquid feed as a whole?
Yeah, no, it's always a question that we'll also get, because guys a lot of times will have to invest in some equipment, right? You got to have some tanks, you have to have some form of delivery unit, and those are upfront costs when you're going to put out or go into feeding a liquid supplement. But there's also things that we've looked at, and when you put liquid out, on the average, it's about every 7 to 10 days during the feed season, except during, say, summertime, whenever cattle aren't really consuming it at a very high level at all, if they are at all, especially during the spring. But if you think about that, where you're on a ranch, you're having to put cubes out or something like that, then you're having to feed just about every day or every other day. And so there's a whole lot more wear and tear on trucks. There's a lot more diesel involved. There's a lot more labor involved in having to actually do that. And so there's savings right there that actually are efficiencies back to the ranch from a labor perspective, from a fuel efficiency perspective, and wear and tear on trucks. And, we're not dealing with $20,000 trucks anymore. We're having to deal with $80,000 trucks. And so that's a big outlay for a particular ranch besides just labor itself, which is harder to get today. So, being more efficient with our labor is really important in the industry today. And I think this is an advantage that we have here with liquid feed, just from the feeding aspect of it. Making a cow more efficient, one of the things that we've actually saw is we can utilize liquid tubs where we can actually put them in different areas. If they're staged right and placed right into the pastures away from water, we're able to pull cattle away from water so we can get better grazing distribution, utilize part of the pasture that a lot of times cattle just don't go to. A lot of times you'll see this in the drought. You start seeing those areas where one that are too far from water, or you also see where there's species of grass that aren't as palatable as other parts of the pasture, right? And so whenever you start going into a drought, that's when you see that. The advantage of a liquid feed from an efficiency standpoint, a lot of times, is you can put a feed trough or something that's even a tub or something like that that's a molasses urea based product, put them in those areas, and those cows will actually go to those areas and they'll start grazing. So it's a more efficient utilization of your pastures as well, not just from a general nutrition perspective. We all like to talk about that because me and Taylor are nutritionists, and that's the first place that goes to our head. But when you really think about managing pastures and you really start thinking about managing expenses on a ranch, I think those are two of the additional efficiencies that we pick up when we have producers that feed liquid feed on pasture.
I would add a couple of things. The other piece to that is I think it's just getting increasingly harder to find good help. And so when we're able to put that supplement out there and let the cows essentially regulate themselves, what I mean by that is having access to that supplement. So we don't have to either ourselves or tie somebody up to go out and feed every morning. And so that convenience factor is really important. Also, we've got a network of dealers that a lot of times they will fill the feeders for you. And so it's an extra set of eyes that come out and able to manage those feeders for you. And so again, that goes into that help piece to where it's getting harder and harder to find good, reliable help. And so I think that's a really important piece, as well as nutrient distribution. We basically, by providing that supplement and that liquid feeder, we're allowing every animal in the herd to get their allotted portion of the supplement. Where, all too many times, I've got experience in this where, if we're feeding a dry feed, let's just say it's some cubes on the ground or in the trough, and we honk them up and we call them up, and, let's say we're feeding 2 pounds per head per day or whatever it might be. Are you confident that every animal in the herd is getting their 2 pounds? There's probably some overconsumption with maybe your more dominant cows, and then some of your more timid cows may not be getting any supplement. And so, at least by having that feeder out there, the liquid feeder out there, every animal has their opportunity to get their portion of the supplement.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, Taylor. And just something that came to mind too is just the efficiency of cows consuming it over the day, two or three times during the day versus at one meal every other day. There's an efficiency in that as well, just because every time that animal consumes that liquid, she's starting the fermentation process again. She's boosting it up again. There's data out of New Mexico State where they looked at frequency of putting into the rumen liquid supplements at three different times during a 24-hour period, and then looking at the fermentation pattern. And there was a more consistent fermentation pattern of forages when they were consuming it multiple times a day versus one time today or every other day. So there's a lot of efficiencies when you start talking about those things when it comes to having liquid feed out 24/7 and also all the way across the ranch, not just the animal itself, but they go hand in hand. And I think there's advantages all over the place.
And we will get more into that topic or question. But before we transition into that, still kind of going back to that urea conversation, is there anything else or any one or two things that you really want ranchers to remember when it comes to urea being fed?
For me, when I think of molasses and urea and liquid supplementation, they complement the grass because it's kind of like a symbiotic relationship between the animal, the grass, and what we're feeding them because we're giving them what's in nature, right? So the one takeaway there is urea, sugar, and grass, they're all a complement to feed the animal.
Yeah, and I agree. And the other thing would be that it is absolutely safe. It is safe. I'm very proud to say we take safety very serious at Westway and as well as our training. And so I've got the utmost confidence in our plant operators, our plant personnel, and that when we get this urea in, that we're able to dissolve it into a solution, and that solution is consistent, and that it's safe, and that when we're mixing feed and when those feed loads leave our plant, that we've got confidence that they are to the specs that we need them to be at to be a safe product. So I've got that confidence in that safe aspect, but also on the ranch, just in terms of the animals utilizing urea, it is a safe product when used appropriately. I would not recommend for somebody to go to the co-op and buy a buggy fertilizer and try to dissolve it themselves and mix it themselves. I think you can run into some issues there. That's something that I've ran into before of having a customer thinking that they could do it more economical. And we've got the equipment, we've got the expertise of how to do that. And that process can get very dangerous because urea toxicity is a real thing, but that when it leaves our plant, that it is safe. And the other thing I would like to add on the urea piece before we transition is, there's a lot of myths out there about urea. And, to name a few, just to kind of, I guess, put them at ease, is debunked is what we called it, was we get a lot of questions regarding horses. A lot of ranchers will turn out some horses with their cows. Maybe they have
Mm-hmm.
access to a lick wheel feeder. Most people think that horses, they're extremely sensitive to urea, and that's actually not true. Horses actually have a higher tolerance of urea than cattle. And so we've got producers that turn out their horses with their cows and have access to that liquid feeder, and we don't see any problems. It's not recommended because the horse's digestive tract is they're not a ruminant animal, and so they're not able to utilize that urea as efficiently like a cow. And so it's just not recommended because they get no benefit out of it, basically, but it's not going to kill them. The other thing is it causes nitrate toxicity. That's a completely different thing that is associated with plants that accumulate the nitrates from, just excess nitrogen in the soil. And so that's a completely different thing, but a lot of people think that nitrate toxicity is the same thing as urea toxicity, and it's not. The other thing is that it's too unpalatable. And so they did some research. It was really actually pretty interesting, but that's one of the main things that I run into is that they won't eat it. It's not palatable. And so what some researchers actually did were they took a cannulated animal, which is basically an animal that has a port directly into the rumen. And so they had, two sets of animals, one of them that were consuming a diet with urea and also ones that weren't. And what they did was they took urea and basically opened up the rumen, dropped it directly into the rumen, and they were able to reduce intake. And so it's not because it's unpalatable, it's because the body has a mechanism of regulating how much ammonia or urea needs to be in the animal because, a lot of people don't realize, but even though the animal isn't eating urea, urea is going to be found in the diet just because of the recycling, the nitrogen recycling that goes on in the cow with her saliva as well as just excreted through the urine. And so it's not that it's unpalatable. And the other one is it burns up their gut. I've had a lot of producers tell me that I can't feed urea, it burns them up. That would be associated with starch and acidosis. And so when we feed too much corn too quickly, or what's called a hot ration, that can basically lower the pH and then give them some acidosis, which essentially kind of just makes the rumen go out of whack because of the pH. And I don't want to get too far into details on that, but that's associated with starch, not urea. And so, again, to go back, urea is safe, it is effective, and we use it on hundreds of thousands of cattle across the country.
Well, I really appreciate you going through and debunking that, some of those myths per se, and Kelly, you sharing the background of urea and liquid feed. I really appreciate that conversation. And transitioning into the next big question that your team gets, and I believe that question is, why should I continue to leave liquid feed out for the cows and make it available year round and throughout the summer?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we do get that a lot. One of the things as a nutritionist is I'm trying to provide the best nutrition to the cow, and I'm trying to do that the most cost-effective way for the producer. And so immediately that sounds like, well, you're just trying to sell more feed. And so when we really kind of step back and evaluate that and kind of work through that, what we find is that they actually don't consume that much more feed. And this is very dependent on where you're located. And so, I cover a pretty big swath of the US with my main focus being kind of Kansas down to Texas, up to West Virginia down to Florida. And so, there I see a lot of different cattle breeds. I see a lot of different forage bases, a lot of different management practices, calving seasons, all that will play into this. But just generally speaking, what we're able to achieve when we leave it out there is when the grass greens up, we want those cows to go out and start grazing and utilize that forage. That's typically our cheapest way that we're able to maintain that cow, even put weight on her, depending on what stage of production she's in. And so we want her to go out and graze. We want her to utilize that forage. Like we just explained why the sugar and the urea are able to complement that, but we want that. And so when the grass is green, really our a little bit of a challenge sometimes is intake. We want them to consume some of it because they're out there chasing green grass. And so when we leave it out there, we're basically allowing those cattle to have access to that. And so when we do that, what we see when we track this is we're able to maintain those cows in better body condition score. And that basically sets us up for success later on. And so we know if we're able to maintain that cow in a good body condition score, she's more likely to breed and stay bred on her first cycle, which in turn is going to put her calving sooner in the calving season, which those calves are going to be older. You're going to have a more uniform calf crop. And then just by simply them being older, you're going to increase your weaning rate. And so basically we're able to maintain those cows in good body condition score, and we're able to increase our conception rate. And I think every producer would agree that that is the objective. The cow, she's a calf factory. Her objective is not to get pregnant, but is to wean a calf. And that's what we're able to basically help increase when we keep it out year round. The other thing is that forage quality is dynamic. It's always changing, depending on if you're cool season annuals, warm season perennials, forage quality is always going up and down, and we either have too much forage or we're too little, right? There's that art to it. And so we don't have a magic crystal ball. We don't know when that forage is starting to decline. And typically, as an indicator, we'll see that cows are starting to lose body condition score, or maybe our pastures are starting to become overgrazed. And so we know just when we keep it out there, when we keep the supplement out there, their intakes start to go back up. That's usually an indicator that your forage quality is starting to go down, or that you're starting to have some forage dry matter restrictions, and just in terms of your pastures, you're probably getting short. And so by doing that, though, basically the cow's telling you that, hey, forage quality is declining, or I'm not getting enough dry matter. However, we're still able to maintain that body condition score, because I think and I've been guilty of this in the past, is, we're reluctant to start feeding sometimes, because it's an expense. And so whether that be in the fall when we have to start feeding hay, or, if we have to start feeding dry feed, whatever kind of supplement it is, it's an expense. And so I think we try to hold on, or a lot of producers try to hold on until the last minute, until they finally have to start supplementing. But by then you're already behind and your cows are behind, and it's going to cost you more money basically to get those cows back to where they need to be. And so again, by having it out there, we don't let those cows fall behind because it's more economical for us to maintain a cow in good body condition score rather than letting one get behind and then trying to catch her back up, especially as she goes into calving and in lactation. At that point, it's a huge expense to try to catch her back up at that point.
Yeah, I would piggyback that on a couple of things. Is just thinking about forage physiology, Taylor. When that grass gets to a certain point, especially in the transition phase of that grass, somewhere in the middle of that, the protein drops out of that. And a lot of times you don't know the actual date of it because it is dynamic, like Taylor said. But, a good rule of thumb in the South is you can say somewhere around mid-July, the protein's going to drop in that grass, even though it's green, even though it looks good, the whole 9 yards. And there's been enough research looking at calf growth and what happens to those calves whenever they are short protein or when their mom is short protein, she's going to drop off on lactation. So a lot of times, if we're not feeding cows or they don't have some type of supplement out in the summertime, that lactation will drop off somewhere, say mid July, like we talked about. And unless we get a rain in August or September, then basically she's just going to continue to do that. Well, that calf's not getting as much nutrition as he once was or she once was. And so ultimately, by providing nutrition through a supplement, you can actually prop those cows back up, maintain lactation. And again, they're just going to have a little heavier calf when it comes to weaning time during that phase as well, along with the whole body condition piece, right? And so that's really important I think, from a summertime perspective. Now, to back up a little bit, Taylor, talking about body condition score and weaning weights and intakes, when we've conducted data that's out there, and there's other research as well that's out there, would show there's about a 15 to 20% lower intake when cows are on a year-round program. And it all goes back to what Taylor said. They're in better body condition score. It requires less feed, additional feed to support those cows to maintain that body condition score. Always liken this to a cow that's in a body condition score 4 versus a cow that's in a body condition score 5. It's kind of like that cow that's in a 5, their nutrition status is just kind of status quo, right? And so they don't really need any additional nutrition. They have plenty stores. That cow that's in a 4, she's behind the 8 ball. She is behind on energy. She's behind on protein. And to make it really simple is if you go out and you build fence all day and you come in for dinner, you've worn yourself out. You're really, really hungry typically, and you're going to overconsume that evening when you're eating typically, or I do. So I overconsume because I need that additional energy. My body stores are gone, and my body wants to refill those body stores. And so ultimately, I liken that to a cow that's in a body condition score 4. So she doesn't have to do that. That cow typically doesn't overconsume on that feed. And so that's where the kind of the 15 to 20% reduction in intake happens. So to say that it costs more, research hadn't really shown that. And so I think that's another advantage to a year-round program. Taylor already talked about the wean and wake advantages and how that data actually proves out from getting calves weaned earlier to heavier weaning weights. But the other piece of that will play into what we know today is this whole topic around fetal programming, right? Or epigenetics. And so there's been enough research today to know that when cows are in a deficient state, protein wise, energy wise, in calves that are in their first and second gestation period, we can actually have a reproductive impact on those heifers out of those cows where they don't breed back near as good when they were in utero and they had a protein deficiency. Same thing with steer mates, right? Steer mates to those heifers when taken to a feed yard and finished out, they didn't grade as good as the ones that had proper nutrition during the wintertime. And so we know there's impacts on the calf itself when that calf is in utero, when the nutrition is not right for the cow. Our paradigm from a industry, though, historically has been trying to get by, having to have that cow get by as cheap as we could actually get her by, right? And a lot of times we'd say, well, body condition score 4, body condition score 4.5, that's perfectly okay because I'm going to turn bulls out in the spring and have all that green grass. And while that helps to some degree, because there is green grass, a lot of times that grass is short. And so we still have a cow that has to actually build enough body condition back before she's actually going to start to cycle again. And so again, that's why a lot of times I feel like we see these 90, 120, 150 day, Kevin windows versus something that's more closer to 75 or 90. And that's the one thing I could say historically since I've been recommended putting feed out year round, as a lot of these ranches, their calving windows are 70 to 80 days. And with the majority of those calves being calved in the first 45 to 50 days. So again, to me, that just proves having proper nutrition, proper body condition score with those cows is extremely impactful to the bottom line without increasing your cost, your feed cost to a producer.
Well, and I think with that is remembering the push that a lot of people are making to have those heavier weaning weights, that push for carcass weights and carcass traits. And that comes with a nutrient requirement that needs to be met for each animal and can't be forgotten.
Yeah, certainly. To me, there's a lot of advantages. When we can put an additional, say, 60 to 80 pounds on average on a set of calves, just because they're born earlier, then you wing that calf, he's 60 to 90 pounds closer to a finished weight, right? So that's an efficiency piece with just in the beef system
Mm-hmm.
that we don't really talk about a whole lot. So plus, from a producer standpoint, I look at that and say, if you've got a set of calves that are a whole lot more consistent all the way across in size, those calves should be worth more, right? We don't have, 6 weights, 5 weights, and 4 weights. We've got a whole bunch of 5 and 6 weight calves. That's a factor in this that creates more value for that producer.
So I always think that fetal programming and just the impacts of having that quality nutrition year round is really beneficial, especially when we talk about, like you guys said, the tighter calving window, the weaning weights, and all the things we can do there to increase efficiency. But some other questions and factors that even are going through my head as a producer who's not used the liquid feeder before and is maybe just used to regular mineral or some lick tubs to supply mineral is, does the liquid feed that you're providing have a full mineral package in it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I get that a lot. And the short answer is it depends. We've got some liquids that do not contain a vitamin trace mineral pack, or maybe contains a partial vitamin trace mineral pack. And then we've got other products that we would call fully fortified that have a full vitamin trace mineral pack. And I think just the thing that needs to be considered though is that there's a lot of different forage bases, there's a lot of different soil types, and so that's going to play into the mineral content that's going to be provided in the forage. As nutritionists, we want to supply all the vitamins, all their minerals. We want to control as much of the nutrition as possible so that we get the most consistent response. Grazing cattle, it's one of the challenges is we can't choose what they go out and graze. We can't control their intake unless we do some sort of physical restraints like letting them out in a pasture for an allotted time and then bringing them back. And so there's a lot of variability in the mineral content of forages across the US. And so when we say fully fortified, that can be interpreted in a few different ways. What I will say though is that, we are able to provide a full vitamin, that being vitamin A, D, and E, to meet their requirements on a given intake. And we can also do that with some of their key trace minerals. And so, we can add phosphorus. Phosphorus is usually a trace mineral that cattle will actively seek. We can also add salt, which animals, cattle will actively seek salt as well, and other minerals like zinc, copper, manganese, magnesium, selenium are other ones that we can add, and we can add those at a full requirement on a given intake. And so the challenge, though, is that there are some other additives that we can also add, in addition to a full vitamin trace mineral pack. And so one of those things can be fly control. We can add fly control through an IGR, We've also got the capability of adding some essential oil blends like garlic that might, that producers might be interested in adding into their liquid, as well as some other things like some other yeast products. We can add in some heat abatement products that might be beneficial for producers in some subtropical climates. And I think that's a really big advantage of the liquid is that we're able to provide the energy, the protein, and then we're able to provide those micronutrients like the vitamins and the trace minerals, as well as some of these other additives to make it a complete supplement.
Okay. So, we've talked about the cows a lot in this conversation, but will calves benefit from consuming this out in the pasture too when it's available?
I've had that question in the past for sure. Because you do see those little calves, they'll start mimicking mama and they'll go up there and they'll start licking on that liquid feeder a little bit. And it's typically around the edges when they're little. And as they get bigger, those calves will start licking that wheel. I can tell you from work that's been done in the past, though, because that question had come up and historically, you know, people were wondering about that. So there was work done looking at is there any performance benefits, things of that nature for calves. And really what it showed was that until that calf gets about 500 pounds, then there's really not a lot. They just don't eat a lot of it. I mean, you got to think about it. A lot of those intakes that we manage are designed for a cow, and you got a little three-weight animal up there consuming it. So they don't eat a lot. And so there's not a lot of nutritional benefit till they hit about 500 pounds. And a lot of that, I think, is because those at 500 pounds, a calf that's still on his mama is eating about two-thirds of his diet is grass and about a third of it's still milk. And so now they're big enough, their rumens are big enough, their rumens are functional enough that they can actually eat enough of the liquid and then actually get more fiber digestion out of the grass. So it's a yes, no answer to that question in the fact that they have to be big enough in order for them to eat enough to have value to them.
And Kelly, another question. So, for people who are maybe used to getting some supplements, just going to the feed store and picking them up themselves, I know earlier in the conversation there's maybe a mention of delivery. Is that something that's standard? Is that just for bigger ranches? How do ranchers obtain liquid feed?
Well, there's a couple of ways. Taylor's talked about it. I guess I mentioned it as well. If you're a smaller producer and you have a dealer in your area, our dealers are out there and they're more than willing to help you with your tanks. They're also more than willing to, go around on a regular schedule and help manage those tanks and keep those tanks full so those cows have liquid in them all the time. But if you're a large enough producer and you have the assets to do it, then you can actually take a direct load from the plant and we'll put it in a kind of a 6,000 gallon storage tank. And then you'll actually need a delivery unit and you can basically put all that liquid out yourself. And that's what most of the large producers are doing. If they're 500 to, in cases when you're in Florida, you got 5 or 6,000 head operations. Most every one of those particular producers are going to take a load themselves, and then they're going to put that liquid out themselves and manage those feeders themselves. So we have a lot of flexibility across the country to try to meet producers' needs from dealers to direct shipments. So it's just whatever size and whatever assets they have that they can utilize to get the liquid out.
All right. Well, Kelly or Taylor, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up today's very informative conversation about liquid feed?
Well, we covered a lot of territory in the hour.
Yeah, I would just say for any producer out there that might be listening that might be interested in liquid feed, please don't hesitate to reach out. I would be more than happy to go through a budget. We do that a lot. Just going through, sitting down and running the economics of it. We can build you a program that's specific for you. And that's what I enjoy is being able to help producers at the end of the day. And one of the things that we evaluate is different feedstuffs. I'm not going to sit here and say that liquid feed is a silver bullet. It's a good tool in our tool belt, and there's other good tools out there as well. And so we can build programs that are specific for you, and at the end of the day, that are going to help you. And so I'd be more than happy to do that for anybody that might be interested in that. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
Well, I will be sure to include information to Westway and some of their resources and contacts in the show notes. That's easy for anyone who is listening to find that and reach out and get some help. But with that, remember, the best way to support this podcast and all your other favorite podcasts is to share them with someone else who would find them interesting and leave a rating and review. But with that, happy ranching, folks.